Hey, welcome back. This is Joseph S. Samaniego, the author of the Carolingian Age fantasy book series, and I am back with another video on a very, very fun subject for me, and I'm sure a lot of you. If you're anything like me, you are dependent on your caffeine and particularly coffee. It don't matter how hot it is outside. It does not matter at any, what time of day it is. I will drink coffee. I will drink around 5 or 6 good-sized cups, probably talking 10 to 12-ounce cups of coffee a day. Some days not as much, but yeah, I can drink a lot of coffee. In fact, a lot of times I'm drinking coffee when I'm doing these videos. So, cheers. So here's to the history of coffee, and let's just get into it. I have not seen this video yet. I know quite a bit about coffee, but I have not seen this video yet, so I'm interested to see what they got to say about the subject.
Curiosity Stream. Get access to my streaming video service, Nebula, when you sign up for Curiosity Stream using the link in the description.
That's pretty much how I look throughout the whole day.
Would life be possible without coffee? Would our modern society cease to function if we could no longer drink our dark, piping hot caffeine elixir? Well, the history of coffee is a fascinating one connected to mystical Muslim Sufis, French revolutionaries, slaves, soldiers, constipation, and alcohol-soaked toddlers. So, what is the history of coffee? Well, let's find out.
Alcohol-soaked toddlers. That sounds scary.
Our story begins in a dark, scary period of human history, the pre-Caphazine. The ancient land of Ethiopia may be the cradle of all humankind, but more importantly, it is the birthplace of coffee. Here in the mountainous rainforest near Kaffa, coffee has grown wild for millennia. We don't exactly know when humans first started consuming coffee, but the most popular story involves some very happy goats.
So isn't it quite amazing how the cradle of so much of humanity, the culture of humanity, starts in Africa? It's really amazing how all the building blocks that came together for humans to even exist, let alone other things like coffee and other just amazing things that we have in this world, but just all the little nuance and just the small little minute details that had to happen for us to exist and for things to exist. This was the perfect environment. And I know we're doing a lot better now at pointing that out, but giving that justice to this continent that is the cradle of our whole existence. It's really cool to just really research a lot of that.
One afternoon, an Ethiopian goat herder named Kaldi noticed his goats hopping about excitedly. Some were even dancing. He saw the goats eating leaves and berries from a small shrub. Kaldi, now curious, decided to eat some himself. Soon his heart was pounding, his mind was racing, and he was dancing with his goats.
Okay, so let's go ahead and just give it up to the explorers such as him and such as so many others who said, I wonder what this tastes like, or I wonder if this is going to be good. And so many who probably did not survive their encounters, but here he did, obviously. It's kind of like a whole joke of a human looking up at a beehive and saying, I wonder what those little bastards have in there. And sticking their hand up a beehive. So it's, let's give it up to these first explorers, culinary explorers, as they are.
The magical, energetic properties of caffeine had been discovered. Now, this is just a story. Kaldi probably wasn't the first coffee addict. The world's first coffee lovers were probably the Oromo people. They've probably been chewing on coffee beans and leaves for thousands of years. They would crush it up and mix it with fat to make ancient coffee power bars. Yep. Coffee leapt across.
And that's actually kind of common with a lot of civilizations that use coffee. At the very beginning, they would actually just chew it more and just kind of let it sit in their mouth more than drinking it.
the Red Sea with Oromo slaves sometime in the mid-15th century to the port city of Mocha in modern-day Yemen. There, the Sufi mystics found that the drink could keep them awake during their long nighttime prayers. It was in Yemen that coffee made from roasted beans is first documented. The most popular species of coffee was born here, Coffea arabica, which now makes up about 60% of the world coffee supply.
Yeah, and you see that a lot. You see that ingredient a lot for when it comes to coffee.
They named the drink kawa, the Arabic word for wine, from which the word coffee probably comes from. By the end of the 15th century, coffee had spread throughout the Islamic world, and the cafe was soon born. Cafes found a niche in Islamic society. Devout Muslims can't really just head down to the pub, so cafes provided the Islamic world with a secular social space outside the home, where Muslim men could engage in lively conversation about politics, business, and religion. Coffee soon became so important that in Turkey, the inability to provide coffee beans was grounds for divorce. But some rulers...
Yeah, and like with a lot of foods, salt, different types of spices, saffron being one, coffee is one of those things that could be used as currency throughout or was used, I shouldn't say could be, because it was used as currency throughout the world, especially the medieval and Renaissance world. Its weight was similar to that of gold, so...
thought people were having a bit too much fun at the cafes. Now, their actual concern was that people were discussing politics and informing themselves, which rulers tend not to like.
No.
Coffee would find itself banned in Mecca and Constantinople for a time during the 15 and 1600s. But coffee drinking continued in secret until the bans were lifted. While Muslims were sipping away in their fancy cafes, to the west of them lay a small, divided and violent backwater called Europe. Since coffee and tea hadn't reached Europe yet and the drinking water was sometimes unsafe, beer was Europe's favourite beverage. A professor of medicine in 1551 stated, "People subsist more on this drink than they do on food. On average, every man, woman and child in England drank over 350 litres of beer per year up to the 17th century, while Germans were putting away 400 to 600 litres. Europe wobbled about under this depressive and confusing alcoholic haze, until Dutch, Venetians and Italian merchants began importing coffee in the 17th century, and a new, stimulating social space opened up. Oddly enough, it was firstly in England that cafe culture captivated Europeans. London's first cafe opened in 1652. By 1700, there were over 2,000 cafes in London, called penny universities because for the price of a cup of coffee, you could sit there and listen to the country's most intelligent people chat. You see, pubs were not the safest places to discuss politics or religion. People were drunk or armed, usually drunk and armed, whereas cafes provided a sober and caffeine-enhanced environment for debate and discussion, which was exactly why King Charles II tried to ban them in 1675.
Yeah, so I love that line there in reference to King Arthur. But yeah, this again, you see this through a lot. Anytime you get a group of people gathering talking about the issues of the day, it usually worries to just I guess use a term that's the least, but it would at the very least worry the aristocracy. It would worry the ruling class. A lot of times it would worry them to the point of actually creating the situation that they're so scared of having, and that happened in many cases where they would get so worried and worked up over people gathering and meeting, not really knowing what they're truly meeting about, or maybe having an idea of what they're truly meaning about, and then they would actually act on it. And by acting on it, they create the situation that they did not want to happen to begin with. So what you ended up having is you taking something that's peaceful and you're turning it into violent. And that's... that happens whether it's coffee, whether it's beer, whether it's wine, whether it's tea, whether it's just meeting together. So,
before quickly being forced to back down.
Yeah.
English cafes would foster early capitalism. Some of the world's largest businesses, like Lloyd's of London, the East India Company, and the London Stock Exchange, all began as cafes. Now, not everyone loved coffee though, especially women who were excluded from cafes. In 1674, they complained. We find of late a very sensible decay of the true old English vigour, our gallants being every way so Frenchified. we can attribute to nothing more than the excessive use of that newfangled, abominable, heathenish liquor called coffee, which has so eunuched our husbands, and spend their money all for a little base, black, thick, nasty, bitter, stinking, nauseous puddle water. We humbly pray that henceforth the drinking coffee may on severe penalties be forbidden, and instead thereof lusty nappy beer and cock ale be recommended to general use. Cock ale, by the way, is beer with a dead rooster in it. The link to their full 6-page complaint is linked below.
What in the hell? What? A dead rooster? Okay. Yeah, that's not happening.
And I highly recommend you go read it for a good laugh. By 1777, coffee was so popular in Prussia that Friedrich the Great complained, "My people must drink beer. His Majesty was brought up on beer, and so were his ancestors." In 1781, he banned citizens roasting coffee and created a secret anti-coffee police force nicknamed Coffee Smellers to sniff out illegal coffee dealers. But like elsewhere, the bans were soon reversed. The Viennese soon became Europe's next big coffee lovers. Their great idea was adding sugar and milk to coffee, creating the Cappuccino, named after the colour of a Capuchin monk's robe, which became known in Italian as a cappuccino. In 1669, a Turkish ambassador introduced Paris to coffee. The French originally didn't like the taste, but no matter how much they disliked the stuff, they were deeply moved by its unique ability to deeply move them. Or, in the words of Paludanus, to breaketh wind and openeth any stopping. Soon French doctors were prescribing.
Okay, we're going to have to look that guy up to see if that's really, that's just hell of a coincidence. But yeah, coffee does that to some people. It's one of those things that it did become this medicinal purpose, and that's one reason why a lot of times it is skirted under the bans that were starting to be put in place. And same with other addictive substances that we know of, and even sodas. When they were first started, sodas were same way. They were being used for that purpose.
Coffee enemas. Now, the bowels weren't the only thing coffee was stimulating in France. It also tickled the mind. Soon after the 1689 opening of the stylish Café Procope, it attracted the likes of Diderot, Rousseau, Voltaire, and Benjamin Franklin. Soon, thousands of Parisian cafes were fueling the Enlightenment. Yeah. On July 12, 1789, Camille Desmoulins delivered a passionate speech from a cafe table and whipped the crowd up into an anti-aristocracy rage. 2 days later, they stormed the Bastille, igniting the French Revolution. Over in British North America, Washington, Hamilton, and Jefferson used cafes as the headquarters of the American Revolution. The now caffeine-addicted Europeans were desperate to find coffee supplies not controlled by the Ottoman Turks. In the mid-17th century, the Dutch brought coffee from India to grow in Ceylon, Java, Sumatra, and across Southeast Asia. Dutch colonists would drown Europe in Asian coffee using enslaved natives. In 1860, Dutch civil servant Edward Douws Dekker quit in disgust and wrote the novel Max Havelaar, which documented the terror taking place on Java and attacked Dutch landowners who grew rich from the poverty of others.
And this was almost like a precursor to Joseph Conrad's book. It goes Into the Darkness, or basically about the Belgium. It's very similar in style to Joseph Conrad's work that was about the rubber plantations in the Belgian Congo. Heart of Darkness, which went into kind of a different take on it, though, as far as being controlled by a madman, but the horrors of what was happening based on that capitalistic idea to grow more of these cash crops, such as coffee, such as rubber, such as tea, and exploit the indigenous people for their labor, and just basically just being terrible colonizers.
1720, Gabriel Mathieu de Clieu brought a coffee plant to the colony of Martinique during a harrowing journey where his ship was attacked by pirates, storms, and dehydration. During the trip, he shared his daily ration of half a cup of water with the tiny coffee plant. His sacrifice paid off though. Within 50 years, there were 18 million coffee trees on the island. The offspring of his plant are now responsible for a huge part of the world's coffee supply. Yep. William Muckers wrote about coffee.
Yeah, we actually, in the United States, we get a lot of our coffee. We really actually get a lot of our coffee from the Western Hemisphere. You know, it'll say it's Colombian or it'll say it's this particular, but the bulk of it is going to come from one source, and then they mix it in with Colombian coffee, so it's percentage of Colombian coffee or Sumatran coffee. But the bulk of it is going to come from probably the Caribbean.
Wherever it has been introduced, it has spelled revolution. It has been the world's most radical drink in that its function has always been to make people think, and when the people begin to think, they become dangerous to tyrants. The irony was that while coffee was seen as helping to free Europe and the US from tyrants, it brought tyranny elsewhere. The Clue almost sacrificed his life for his tiny coffee plant, but he never actually thought of harvesting it himself. Slaves from Africa would do that. By the 1780s, 60% of all the coffee consumed in Europe came from the tiny French colony of Saint-Domingue, harvested by over 500,000 African slaves. So the coffee that nourished Voltaire and the Enlightenment involved the most barbaric form of forced labour.
Yep.
J.H.B. de Saint-Pierre noted while travelling in the Caribbean in 1773, "I do not know if coffee and sugar are essential to the happiness of Europe, but I know well that these two products have accounted for the unhappiness of two great regions of the world. America has been depopulated so as to have land on which to plant them, and Africa has been depopulated so as to have the people to cultivate them." The 1789 French Revolution inspired the slaves in Saint-Domingue to rebel and demand their own freedom, creating the slave-free nation of Haiti in 1804. But when it comes to the quantity of slaves though, Brazil takes the awful cake. Just in the first half of the 19th century, 1.5 million African slaves were shipped here to work on coffee plantations known as latifundia, which made coffee men some of the wealthiest in Brazil. This led to Brazil keeping slavery longer than any other nation in the Western Hemisphere. It only outlawed it in 1888. Brazil conquered the coffee world. It produced such an extraordinary amount that it helped increase demand by making coffee cheap enough for members of North America and Europe's working class. Brazil democratized coffee through slavery. By the 1920s, Brazil was producing 80% of the world's coffee. It's been the world's leading coffee producer for over 150 years, and in 2017, it produced 2.5 million tons. That's a third of the global coffee supply. Wow. Coffee made modern Brazil, but at an enormous cost. Brazil was, according to Eduardo Galeano, ruined by a plant whose destructive form of cultivation left forests razed, natural reserves exhausted, and general decadence in its wake.
Again, this goes back to the whole cash crop aspect of they're going to clear land, they're going to try to get it as cheap as they can, cost to make, so they can sell it for as much of a profit as they can. And that includes slave labor, deforestation, and just basically ruining the land for this amount of cash. And what they don't consider is the harmful effects that that's having, because it's based on greed. Even now, the deforestation is continuing. So it's just one of those. It is a terrible thing when you depend on how you get your commodities.
As Brazil conquered the coffee world, Central America followed in its footsteps. The history of Guatemala is an example of what happened to the entire region. After gaining independence from Spain, the government turned to coffee cultivation as a potential source of wealth. Prime coffee growing lands were, however, occupied by indigenous peoples such as the Maya. This land was then confiscated by rich coffee growers. Then indigenous peoples were forced to work on the new massive coffee plantations. They were watched over by an enormous army. Jeffrey Page wrote in Coffee and Power, Guatemala had so many...
And that was actually, we kind of mentioned that already in the last video about Maya and Aztec. That was kind of already happening with the haciendas in Mexico. They were already taking the native, the indigenous peoples and creating these ranches and lands where they were basically slaves.
Soldiers that it resembled a penal colony because it was a penal colony based on forced labor. This system dominated Central America. The only local exception was Costa Rica. You see, most of Costa Rica's indigenous peoples had been killed off centuries before by Spanish settlers and disease. So when Costa Ricans began growing coffee in the 1830s, they couldn't run those large slave plantations like Brazil and Guatemala. Now, they still enslaved some, but there just weren't that many. Instead, small farming families working together did the physical labor. By not relying on slave labor, Costa Rica was able to develop into a more united and stable nation. In 1906,
And you actually see that today because Costa Rica, of all the Central American nations, is probably the most developed and most advanced. I don't like using the term third world a lot, but when you look at the third world nations, Costa Rica, I think, is now considered to not be one anymore. And it was really the first of the Central American nations to kind of achieve that moniker. But it really did allow their independence and their reliance on themselves, as opposed to relying on indigenous labor, indigenous slave labor, or slave labor from elsewhere as the majority of their people. Because the other aspect you got to think of is when people realize that they outnumber the oppressors, war typically happens. Look at Haiti. Look at France. Look at all these places that had revolutions. When they realize that they outnumber the ones that are putting them down, they're going to fight back. And that destabilizes a lot of things. It's good that they're getting that freedom, but at the same time, it's going to cause a destabilization because other nations will be skeptical to work with them at first until they kind of proven themselves or until there's a power source. And Costa Rica developed that power source early by saying, we are doing this ourselves. And it actually eventually led to them being a lot more developed than other countries and more stable for a longer period of time.
1906, while in Guatemala, George Washington, an oddly named Belgian, mixed refined coffee crystals with water to brew coffee instantly. Now, he wasn't the first to invent instant.
Okay, I just want to say that I have lived off instant coffee for a long time. I prefer not instant coffee, but I have lived off instant coffee for a long time. You get used to the terrible taste. But for a long time, it was the only source I really had. So it sustained me. Instant coffee, I've written this in a couple books, and I had one of my beta readers ask me about it. And it's just like, if you've never had instant coffee, you don't understand how terrible it tastes until you get used to it. Because it tastes terrible.
Coffee, but he was the first to mass produce it. His invention came just in time for the First World War and its massive demand for instant coffees. In 1918, the US Army bought the entire George Washington instant coffee output. By the time the war ended, the US Army was preparing over 40 million cups of coffee daily. So let's head back to Asia for a bit. In 1869, an outbreak of leaf rust caused by the fungus Hamilia vastrix began. It first appeared in British-controlled Ceylon and wiped out all of their coffee Arabica plants, along with India's, Java's, Sumatras, and the rest of Southeast Asia's. Many had to switch to growing tea and turned Britain into a tea-drinking nation. This started a panicked search for other species of coffee. Enter Coffea canephora, better known as Robusta. Native to Central Africa and discovered just as the fungus ruined Asian crops. It turned out to be disease-resistant, twice as caffeinated as Arabica, and grew essentially anywhere in the coffee belt. Its only disadvantage was that Robusta beans, well, they taste like arse. They need to be blended with some Arabica to be drinkable. Then in 1938, Nestlé launched Nescafé, a new and improved powdered instant coffee, and took over the global instant coffee market. The taste of instant coffee was so bad that it didn't really matter if you used cheap Robusta beans, leading to a cheap instant coffee industry boom in the post-World War II period. Today, Robusta
So I told you, it tastes bad.
makes up about 40% of global coffee production. Competing with instant coffees were the Italians. In 1884, Angelo Moriondo invented the first espresso machine, which was then improved upon in 1901 by Luigi Bezzera. This new espresso was made by forcing almost boiling water under high pressure through very fine coffee grounds. Before this, coffee would take up to 5 minutes to brew. Espresso cut this down to 30 seconds and produced a much more consistent cup. By the 1930s, espresso was in cafes all over Europe and the United States. The speed of espresso and espresso-made drinks made it the ideal beverage to grab before work and during newly invented coffee breaks. It became the perfect drug to fuel the rise of capitalism. Now much of the world orders their coffee in Italian, espresso.
Yeah, so if you look here, I love these because it shows you just exactly what you're getting. And I always get the Americano. Honestly, I love Americanos. But yeah, if you look here, you kind of see what you're getting. It is a lot of great drinks that you can try.
Cappuccino, latte, macchiato. Sure, even the Americano, a drink invented for American soldiers, is ordered in Italian. All remnants of Italy's espresso revolution. Except Frappuccino. That's not a word. That's nonsense. The espresso...
That's my wife's favorite too. Yeah, so, we have to give a lot of credit to Italy for just being very similar to the explorers that ate weird shit. They experimented with coffee, just like they experimented with other things too. And by doing that, they created this wide range of drinks that we can enjoy today. And really kind of, feel better about our day. Because honestly, when I get that coffee, it tastes good. I don't care if it's Starbucks. I don't care if it's homemade. I don't care where. I just love coffee.
The revolution soon moved into the home and fueled the creation of dozens of espresso-spurting household appliances. Within the coffee industry up until now, all the focus had been on creating the perfect or cheapest cup. But the beans that produced people's lattes were harvested by near-starving peasants. So, Fairtrade International began in 1997 to try and guarantee a certain fair standard.
I'm glad he brought this out because I was actually thinking about it because I remember I've been enjoying as much as I can. Sometimes when you get coffee from somewhere, you don't know if it's fair trade or not, but I've been enjoying fair trade for as long as I can because I love what the fair trade aspect, and there's other fair trade similar style companies, especially when they come with chocolate, they come with other kind of spirits, tequilas and stuff, and chocolate, coffee, and I love to use those because I really do feel that protecting humanity as far as the working class and people who are out there providing this to us should come first. Definitely. We should definitely kind of look to the people who are helping us cultivate these cash crops as opposed to just trying to give money to the corporations.
For products such as coffee. To be labelled fair trade, the production chain must follow fair trade standards, such as workers', environmental and children's rights, along with the payment of the fair trade minimum price. Fair trade coffee sales have soared since its launch, but it has garnered its fair share of critics. It's not a perfect system, but it has done much to improve some lives and working conditions. Caffeine is now the world's most...
So, in going back to the fair trade, there's definitely some flaws in this system. Just like any system that you have, there's always going to be some flaws. And it is a little bit more expensive depending on the brand you're getting. But that aspect is that it's getting better and it's improving as people use it and as people recognize the flaws and work to correct them. So it is getting better. It's definitely... And it's really great tasting coffee too, and great tasting chocolate. I know Anthony Bourdain was working on something prior to his death for a better chocolate, better cultivated and more humanely cultivated chocolate. It would have been more expensive, but it was going to be done in a better way, and that's more important than the cost for a lot of us. And even I know Himalayan salt is another thing that, people are really crazy about Himalayan salt or pink salt or whatever kind of bullshit with the salt. And it's the same thing. You got these companies, you're buying it from these companies that are paying the workers that are cultivating the actual crop. They're paying them cents, literal cents. And that's got to stop. We got to do better to the people who are putting food on our tables.
Popular drug, and coffee is its most popular agent. We now brew about 1.4 billion cups of coffee every day. From a mystical Muslim drink, to colonial commodity, to revolutionary beverage and the fuel of capitalism, this small African bean has transformed our world. Coffee is one of the many foods that has changed human history. If you'd like to know more about how food has transformed our world, I'd recommend you check out The History of Food over on CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a document.
All right, we're going to leave it there because you can see CuriosityStream, and I would go check it out. I think if you have Sling, there's also, you can set up a channel for CuriosityStream on there. I've seen it a few times. So yeah, coffee is one of those drinks that's accompanied humankind through a lot of changes, similar to tea, similar to beer. And what we don't see is the labor behind it. So I'm glad that this focused a lot on that. I think we need to focus a lot on that. But apart from that, I really want to say that, when you get people together and you start talking ideas, it's usually leads to something. Usually leads to change, because you start having discussions, and discussions are always great. You want to discuss things. You want to have talk. You want to have communication. So that's always a great thing to have. And coffee is one of those great drinks to have while you're talking, whether it's talking about social things, whether you're talking about politics, or whether you're just talking about just random bullshit that happens to your day. It's all fun. If you ever get a chance to have Turkish style coffee, take it. It's totally different. It's totally different experience. It's coffee, but it's a whole different experience. And I also would like to recommend that if you put a little hot chocolate mix in your coffee, it kind of mixes, gives you a nice little new flavor to it. I like doing that during the winter time when hot chocolate is more common. So anyway, that's the history of coffee. It's pretty cool, just to kind of think about that. So remember, check out my books you can find them on Amazon, and like and subscribe, and so we can see more content. Till next time, this has been Joseph S. Samaniego, the author of the Carolingian Age fantasy book series, and I'll see you next time.